Okay, we have encountered several different occasions when we talked about interpreting text, parts of the Bible text. So in this session, we will look at some different ways that we can, in a little bit more organized manner, engage the text, and in particular, letters. So let's share our PowerPoint and see what methodological ways we can engage this. So I want to give an overview first of what this entails. So studying the text, and in particular the New Testament text, I think it kind of incorporates different aspects. So before we're going to look at John chapter 3, verses 1 through 16 as a test case, I want to give you some leading points that are pretty much true for every time that you encounter a text, be it in the Old Testament or the New Testament. And will get us ready to look through John chapter 3. So the first thing to do is when we encounter a text is to see what kind of text it is, okay? Is the text in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the first part of the biblical story narrative, or is it in the New Testament? This is very important, right? Because you want to know where this is playing in terms of the story. Is this before Jesus comes on the scene, or is this after Jesus comes on the scene? Which has everything to do with what covenant are we operating under? Are the people still looking forward to Jesus coming, or is this after Jesus has lived his life, or is this while Jesus is living his life? Is this a recording of the main events during his life? And so when people do Bible studies or they're preaching on it, and it's just kind of flip-flopping back and forth kind of topically, the topic is faithfulness. We're just kind of flip-flopping, but I get a little bit nervous, okay? Because we need to know where we are in the topic. Sometimes I encounter people to say, you know, I want to live a biblical lifestyle. That makes me real confused, because what do you mean you want to live biblically? Do you mean like during the time of the Mesopotamians? Are we going to go back to the time of Genesis? Like you're going to get some concubines, like helper wives? I'm not so sure how enthusiastic I'm going to be when my husband brings home some extra wives, and I'm like, what's going on, honey? And he goes, oh no, we're going to live biblically. These are my concubines. I'm pretty sure that, for most of us, I mean, we are diverse, but that might not be acceptable, right? Or is it during the time of the kings, when people on high had more power and just called their shots, and everybody else just kind of bowed down to that, and again had multiple wives, finances differently? Is it during the time of the kings and what we call the Levant? Or is this during the first century? So we're going from an ancient Near Eastern setting to a Mediterranean setting, just engulfed in Hellenism. Is that what we're talking about? So when we say biblical living, we are just crossing between different millennia and different centuries, and you kind of see things kind of shift. Even the idea of marriage and relating to one another, and even Jesus changes things. He says, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say unto you," and then he switches the paradigm. So where are we in these paradigms, right? So know where the text is at that we're dealing with. What genre? And by that, I mean, what type of literature are we dealing with? So the Bible is a collection of books, right? And if we extract the story from it, we come up with a biblical narrative. They're not necessarily placed in historical order, right? So we have to extract the history, the historical narrative from it. But it's presented to us in textual works, in literary format. Well, there's different genres, just like you have different genres of movies and books. So the text that you're studying, we're now kind of going through the letters, right? But the text that you're studying, like in case of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is it law literature, the first 5 books? Is it poetry? Part of that too. Is it narrative? Is it prophetic literature, like talking about the prophets who spoke into the social communities? What is it? In the New Testament, are we talking about the gospel narratives, that those Hellenistic sort of lives, focusing on the main events? Is it a little bit more historical, if you will, the idea of the book of Acts? Are they letters? And among them, we're going to see are just some recorded sermons, perhaps, like the letter to the Hebrews. Is it apocalyptic, like the revelation of John? What are we dealing with? Where do we find it? And even within these complete books, there's some subdivisions. Sometimes you have some prose, or you have some oracles, or you have some poetry, and sometimes you have narrative parts within another genre. So you need to know, like, how am I supposed to look at that? I mean, certainly when you view a movie, you have a different set of expectations and interpretive ways to view it if you're looking at a vampire movie than when you look at a documentary about something, right? If something is a romantic movie as opposed to some sitting at the edge of your seat sort of thriller. So the same is true here. What is the literary context? What's going on in the immediate context of the story? What comes before it? What comes after it? What's the flow? What's going on? What's the historical background? Like I said, where are we in the story? What's going on? If it talks about an exile, then who is moving in and who is moving out? When you have a New Testament and somebody's saying, "I appeal to the emperor," well, then who's the emperor? What's going on? And if it says that people are feeling persecuted, there's religious tension, then what's going on in the background? So what's going on there? What's the cultural context? What are some ways that people treat one another? What are the expectations? If there are some conflicts, like in the New Testament, between leaders and they're challenging and charging each other, what's the cultural context? Is it this idea of defending one's honor? If it talks about not allowing people for over 3 days in your home, what are these different interactions than we might be used to? Certainly. I mean, this is this idea of hospitality, which is really high around the Mediterranean. So what cultural context are we talking about here? I would always encourage you to look for the bearing upon Jesus's life and ministry. And I want to caution you that when you deal with the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, to not read Jesus backwards into the story. We always read the story forward to him coming. So we don't go into some passages in the Old Testament and say, well, this represents this or that about Jesus, because Jesus hasn't come on the scene yet. But you sometimes see a people pining and kind of yearning for something different. And you say, yeah, compared to what Jesus described as the ideal life in the community, that's not it yet. We need something else. And so you look forward to that. But when you get past the middle of the Bible and you go to the New Testament, and you go past the Gospels and you go to the letters that describe the life in the early Jesus communities, they are seeking to apply what Jesus lived out loud. So what does it look like? So we went through the correspondence, right, of the Thessalonian correspondence and the Corinthian correspondence, and if you look for advice on like marriage, we looked at 1 Corinthians 7 and the surrounding, and Paul talks a little bit about marriage and about relationships between husband and wife. And sometimes we can get really focused on these kind of things, these specific applications to specific Jesus communities, churches, in specific times, and we can get real focused and get real carried away, but always go back to Jesus's life and ministry. Jesus may not have said a whole lot about marriage per se, but he sure had a lot to say about how we treat one another. But sometimes I think we need to do more teaching and preaching and just seeking wisdom from Jesus. Sometimes your marriage problems are solved when we just treat people nicely, when we just apply Jesus' sermon to life in the real world. And if we would just do that, why do we go to the application and bypass the teachings of Jesus, right? So keep a focus on that. And then I want to, in just a moment, look forward and go to what I call a principle that's called prescriptive and descriptive, especially when you're dealing with letters in the New Testament. You want to ask, is this a prescriptive principle or a descriptive sort of thing? So we're going to come to that. And how do we apply it today? And by that, I mean, what's the so what point? If this is special literature, if people consider this sacred literature, like this is like God has something to do with it, okay, then we don't just read it and go, then we do something with it. Okay, so let's look at John 3, 1 through 16. It's the text where Jesus encounters a rabbi, a Jewish teacher. He comes to Jesus at night, and he kind of wants to know what Jesus is all about, right? So picking that up here and looking at it, it says, now there was a man of the Pharisees, so it's the particular Jewish group, named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. And he comes to Jesus by night, and he says, Rabbi, I know that you are a teacher that comes from God, for no one can do these signs unless God is with him. So at this point, you should already be suspicious, because does this guy really mean it, or is he setting Jesus up for it? And scholars are divided over this. Some people say like, oh, this guy was really close. And others say like, no, he's setting him up. So spoiler alert, at the very end of the gospel, Nicodemus actually is with another leader, and they're going to bury Jesus's body. So no matter where you are in his argument, in the end, he kind of seems to come through, right? So Jesus then says, well, I'll say to you, unless one is born, he cannot, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Okay, and then it goes on, and then the rabbi actually challenges that, and he goes, how can somebody be born again? I mean, pretty much can you crawl back into your mother's womb and be born again? And so then Jesus actually is pretty harsh. He says, are you a teacher of Israel? Are you a Jewish teacher? You don't know this stuff? That's pretty much a problem. And then he kind of puts him straight. And then we come to verse 16. And even when people are not Christians, just by virtue of living in America, often this kind of rings a bell and people have heard it, because it says, for God so loved the world, this is Jesus saying it to the rabbi, that he gave his only son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Now this verse, this is John 3:16, is often used to tell people about Jesus. And I grew up in a non-Christian setting. I had no idea about what Jesus was about. I never really knew anything about Jesus anyways. But I would go to soccer games in the Netherlands, and I would see people tow around little signs. And it would say Joe, J-O-H, 3:16, 3:16. So J-O-H is an abbreviation for Johannes, which is the Dutch name for John. So that's the name for the Bible book. And I always wondered what Joe was. I mean, is this like some famous place? And what were the numbers? You know, what's Joe? And so in America, you see that sometimes as well. You see people at football games that hold up a sign, John 3:16. So here's a little tip. If you want people to know your message, don't give them a code that people don't understand. I had no idea who Joe was. I still don't know who Joe is. Maybe just hold up the Bible verse, for God so loved the world. Okay. So is this point then, being born again, and is this point about God so loving the world, is this really about sharing Jesus with other people? Is Jesus really just telling the rabbi, so this is what it means to become a follower? Does the rabbi really not get what this is about? Okay, so walking through our list, we have a text. Is it Old or New Testament? It's New Testament. The genre is the gospel genre. So it's focusing on main events in Jesus's life. Let's look at the literary context. Okay, well, we go to the end of chapter 2. In chapter 2, Jesus shows that he just does not like a temple. Remember, John already starts with that chapter. He throws everything around. He turns over money changers. And he's pretty much saying, I am so done with this religious system. So Jesus is actually done with people like Nicodemus. Okay. And then he goes to a wedding and he changes water into wine. It's a tremendous miracle. He's saying, I'm done with water. It's time for It's time for wine. We need something new. And at the end of chapter 2, Jesus is actually at a Jewish festival in Jerusalem. And it says, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing, like turning water into wine. And it says, but Jesus, on his part, he did not entrust himself to them, like these people at the Jewish festival. Because it says, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about people. It says, for he himself knew what was in people. And then John continues the telling of the story, and he says, now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus. It's almost like, let me tell you about one of these people. I know what's in people. So what did Jesus know about this guy? What did he know that we may not readily see? So he comes at night, and he actually, I think, does not want to follow Jesus at that point. Actually, we know from chapter 1 in John that his cousin, Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, he's been baptizing people. And he's not been baptizing pagans, he's been baptizing Jewish people. And that's not the people that you baptize in that setting. Guess who were baptized? It was a baptism of cleansing, a baptism of repentance, of turning from your wrong ways. The people that normally were baptized were people who were kind of like outside the Jewish community who wanted to come in. We call them proselytes. You baptize them to come into the community. You're not going to baptize people who are already in it, Jewish people. Jewish people believe, right, that they were already in it because they were born into the family of Abraham. They don't need to be baptized. They're already in it. And John goes around and he says, you need to be baptized. You need to be clean. You're dirty. And then to make matters worse, Jesus actually says, baptize me. And it's like, you cannot be the one to come to save us because you're kind of indicating that you're that you're from the outside. And so the rabbi goes, I got it. Let me talk to Jesus. I'll go at night and I'll get the information from him. And he goes, Sir Jesus, let me tell you, how come? What's going on? And Jesus gives him a riddle. And he says, unless you're born the water and of the Spirit, you cannot see the kingdom. And so he's really just saying, because guess what? Nicodemus figures he does not need to be baptized. He's a Jewish person. They don't need all that. And Jesus is pretty much saying, unless you do that, you will not be part of my community. It's kind of head on. And then he says, and you are a leader of these people and you don't get it? Very interesting. And so he pretty much says, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. You're just not getting it. I'm the Son of God. That whosoever believes in me and gets baptized, pretty much, will not perish. Pretty much, Nicodemus, if you don't get with the program, time to perish. Very interesting. So cultural background is the cultural background on who gets baptized. Why do they get baptized? Why is Nicodemus so upset? He's upset because he's followed a system all his life. Now, going back to the rest of the literary context, when you go to chapter 4, in chapter 4, there's actually a woman who is not the right kind of Jew. It's a Samaritan woman. They're kind of like a sidetrack. They're the people that they kind of look down on. They despise her, and Jesus meets her. So first of all, she's a woman. She's out by the well, and too often when people talk about this woman, they focus on the fact that she says something that she's had several men, and the one that she's living with, she doesn't know. But the point of this story is that Jesus knows stuff about her life, which makes her think, is he a prophet? Does he know stuff about me? And Jesus engages her in a conversation. Notice that in chapter 3, Nicodemus comes to Jesus, but Jesus goes to the woman. Jesus initiates that. It was interesting, right? And it's a woman, and typically people don't do that because it becomes kind of shameful. Jesus goes to her. She's not the right kind of woman. She's the one that they put on the outside. They're the ones that Nicodemus would say, yeah, baptize her. And they have a conversation, and the end, the lady says, I see you're a prophet. You know, it's kind of like, we've been having these tough conversations about where should we worship. And Jesus says, don't worry about it. You know, you don't need to be worrying about whether you're going to worship where Nicodemus says you would worship, or you said you should worship. There's a new time coming where people will be worshiping in spirit and in truth. It's going to be all new. It's going to be a time of wine. Okay. He says, but the Messiah will come. And actually, the lady says, we're waiting for the Messiah. Then he says, the one who's talking to you is it. He tells her that he is that person. The time that he talks to this woman is in the middle of the day. It's that contrast. It's that contrast. And we're supposed to pick up on the contrast. How does this then relate to the life and ministry of Jesus? We are supposed to look for new ways that God is relating to us and then very unassumingly follow him and do likewise. Look for those kind of people in our lives. So when we look at John 3, 1 through 16 as a test case, sometimes we just think we got it all figured out and we don't. And when it says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life, that's really a corrective. You know, sometimes you got to just step away from what you think is right and just be open-minded. Yeah. So let's look at the other principle then. What is a prescriptive reading or descriptive reading, especially when we deal with the letters? Okay. So this is not a method to look at what the text says. This is reflective. This is about exploring how we tend to read. This will tell you more about you than it tells you about the text, but it's important for us to pick up on, okay? Because we either read prescriptively or we read descriptively. So if you're going to Google this and people tell you that you can tell from the text if something is prescriptive or descriptive, you're talking about something else. This has to do with how you respond to the text. So let me give you a definition. So if you read prescriptively, you are interpreting. You are gathering meaning from the text by reading prescriptively. So the text is read and understood as being instruction. So you decide to read it in this way. It is so you decide to read it as a way like you need to implement it, like do what it says in the same way at all time and all places. It's like prescription medicine. You take something 3 times a day with some food because it says that. That's how you read the Bible. But if you adhere to a descriptive interpretation, then your approach to reading a text is you see it as a narrative. You see it as an account of what happened in a certain place at a certain time for a certain reason. This is how you decide to read the text. You decide that it describes what happens. So in that case, it either fits the overall purpose of the greater story, the biblical narrative, and so you get meaning from that, or there's some sort of principle for living in that you can kind of migrate from there. Okay? So what it is not this. Reading prescriptively or descriptively has nothing to do with whether the text appears prescriptive or descriptive. When it says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, or if your hand causes you to sin, chop it off, that would appear prescriptive, like something that you do. Well, most people would say, I'm not going to pull out my eye and cut off my hand because I'm sinning. This is just something that it described at the time what the people believe. Okay, so it has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with how you decide how you read the text. Here's another caveat. You read one way or the other. You don't do it both. You can't have it both ways. You cannot be a little bit pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. It's impossible to read one passage both ways simultaneously. And I mean, no insensitivity for those who are trying to get pregnant or whatever, but it's a black and white sort of choice. So how do people go about picking and choosing, right? Well, that's precisely the point, to know ourselves. And this is true with every kind of literature that we read, right? The point here is we bring ourselves to the text. We've been influenced. And what we think the text is supposed to say is often what we bring to the text, and then we read it that way. It's an awareness of what we think. So what does it look like to do a descriptive and prescriptive reading of this text? This is at the end of a letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 16. This is a long goodbye by the writer. The writer is Paul. He writes to Christians in Rome, and he says, here's what you should do. Greet one another with a holy kiss. all the churches of Christ greet you. So if I choose to read this prescriptively, I would choose to read this in a way that this is like a command. This prescribes how to read and prescribes, how to live. So let's look at that. In that way, it would tell me how to live, but not only that, how to live back then and how to live now. So this was written to Rome, and then I would decide then how for me to live today where I live. So, but you cannot then start to read it figuratively. So if it says to greet one another with a holy kiss, I am to greet other believers with a holy kiss, not a hug, not a halfway kiss, but a holy kiss. So I would have to figure out what a holy kiss was in Rome and emulate that, do it exactly the same way. And then making sure that whenever I meet people far away, that I bring greetings from other churches, because that's what it says to do. The moment that I start interpreting a holy kiss, it's like, well, but where we live here, we don't really give a holy kiss. We give a holy hug, or we give a high five, or we just kind of nod. That very moment you have turned descriptive. You cannot do both. So what would a descriptive reading look like? Well, that's often a little harder, okay? Because then you look at the bigger story and the bigger principle here. So apparently, Paul is writing to people to greet one another in a culturally appropriate way. So you could say, okay, so then when Christians meet Christians, we should greet one another. We should be excited to meet one another and greet one another in a way that's culturally appropriate. And that differs from place to place, right? Or in general, it could have something to do with our attitude toward others, to be encouraging and receptive. Let's do another one. This is in the book of Ephesians, chapter 5. It says, be subject or submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So out of deep respect for Christ, we submit to one another, we bow down to one another, that kind of thing. Okay, so think with me here. A prescriptive reading. This is in a passage where it talks about the church, people in general. It talks about singing together and doing stuff together. And then after this, it goes over into husbands and wives, and then sadly enough, slaves and masters, and then children and parents. So be subject to one another is believers, Jesus followers in the church. If I do it prescriptively, it prescribes that that's what we do. Believers, when believers have different opinions or something, we say, I'm not always in agreement with you, but I take your point. And the other person says, yeah, I take your point too. And really, it's a strong sort of language there, like, okay, and I do that because I respect you because of Jesus. A descriptive reading here would be what? Like you're generally mutually kind to one another, that we respect partnership sort of approaches, we respect teamwork. Okay, that's verse 21. Now we go on to the next verse. Whoa, wives, be subject to your husbands as you all are to the Lord. It leans on the previous verse. In fact, that verb is actually not in that verse. It actually says, wives to your husbands as you are to the Lord's, because it gets from the previous verse this idea of submission. Okay, if you read this prescriptively, you'll have to figure out in the context what it meant. And in the context, that really meant that husbands had authority over their wives. They could beat them, no problem. They could tell them to stay put, no problem. So if you bring that into today's context, it would look like that. Some people go like, well, but there's all sorts of caveats now. In that context, that's what it is. And so then you do that today too. So then wives are underneath husbands, and husbands rule over wives today. What if you take it descriptively? Okay, descriptively would say, well, it's written to a community of Jesus believers in Ephesus. This is in Turkey. It's a long time ago. During a time, people were very patriarchal. It was actually a code by Aristotle. That's the way it was done in the culture. And apologize, that's your call. And at that time, that's just the way it was. Now, you don't find it in every letter. In some letters, it's more nuanced. Actually, we have letters where husbands and wives work together. We actually have examples where women lead the churches. So it seems to be that this is very specific for this community in Ephesus. So a descriptive reading would say, wow, this is actually a solution to some issue going on in Ephesus. So a descriptive reading would say, this is written by a person to Ephesus in a very pastoral sort of way, saying, there's some stuff going on there. And it's best if we kind of blend in with culture here. And this is what the culture does. Not always ideal, but this is what the culture does. So why don't we do some of that? And then a little bit later on, that will be through the prescriptive as well. It talks a little bit about, what that looks like. Don't be harsh. Don't be unkind. So what it would look like today is that if there are troubles between people in the church, then you look and make sure that you're not completely weird from the culture and that you find kind solutions. And this is really an encouragement for leaders to be resourceful and kind and to work with relationships in light of culture. So our culture is really not shifting towards patriarchy. Our culture is shifting the other way, where women are equal partners. And that would be the descriptive reading. Ooh, when we keep going, it gets uncomfortable, doesn't it? Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling and singleness of heart as you obey Christ. This is only just a little section further away from the part that we just looked at. See that? So this is just a little further, the start of the next chapter. It's still the same train of thought. You subject to one another, wives to husbands, and then it keeps going, slaves to earthly masters. So if you want to do this prescriptively, you really need to have slaves. And you really need to have slaves obey their masters. And not just in any way, with fear and trembling. They really need to bow down to these masters. This is the part where people sometimes say, well, not every master was bad. Well, then why do you need to fear and tremble? So a prescriptive reading would mean that you take it very straightforward. So if in that setting you had slaves, then in this setting we have slaves. If in that setting you had earthly masters, then in this setting it's okay to have earthly masters. If in that setting they were to fear and tremble, then in this setting you fear and tremble. And not just for any reason, but because it's out of obedience to Christ. Whoa, this is so hard, right? Here's another thing. If you chose to read the wives submit to your husband just a few verses before, why would you switch here and suddenly do a descriptive reading? What makes you decide to just flip-flop between that. Like this one I do prescriptive, this one I do descriptive. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, it's because we no longer do this, the question would become, why don't we no longer do this? Because it's abhorrent. Because it's completely contradicting everything that Jesus stood for. So why is wives submitting to the husband also not contradicting what Jesus stood for? You see where we're going with this? So what do we do with this? Here's what you cannot do. You cannot say, I'm taking this prescriptively, but slaves, I've heard this in churches, but slaves, that's more like employees. And masters are employers. This is more like Christians should be nice in the working world. Well, first of all, it doesn't flow, besides the fact that you can do it, because I have a boss and he's very nice here at UMHB, but I don't serve him. I don't obey him with fear and trembling. That's HR would have a cow. That's not the way we conduct our ministry here. And that's not the way that we teach here at UMHB. We are respectful. We don't fear and tremble. That's just not the way we do things in our culture. And that's not the way we ought to do things in our churches either. We don't fear and tremble for our Christian leaders. That's just not okay. The second reason that this, of course, is not okay is because you cannot mix descriptive and prescriptive readings. You either take it all the way or you go descriptive. I think the descriptive reading, the only thing that I can do with this is so abhorrent, is that there are times that you blend with culture for the sake of making a much bigger impact and doing away with this evil altogether. Maybe they were plotting all along to do away with this evil institution, or maybe the writing is wrong, okay? But you can't have it both. So very interesting, right? Last one, I think it's the last one. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from the worship of idols. This is in 1 Corinthians. So you can do this, right? Prescriptive, what would it look like? You literally flee from the worship of idols, like idol gods, like little idol gods that I've lived in areas where people have that. Here in the United States, we have people that have idols, have a special place in their house where they have idols represented, and they worship that. And so the word here is, don't do that. Apparently they did it in Corinth. And if you read it prescriptively, the word is, if you do that here, you should not do it. In fact, you should run from it. What this is not, this is the descriptive reading is not, you should not worship idols and then replace idols for your car, your phone. You cannot just replace one thing. A descriptive reading would have to do with, what did these idols represent? The idols did not represent just one object of worship, right? Idols represented a much broader thing in culture, but it was religiously based. It was religion. It was something that purely took the place of God religiously. So you can really not make an application there of it being something materialistic. So this is really rough, right? But the main point here is that you choose. And the one thing that you don't want to do is pick and choose and pick and choose. You go from one verse and the two verses later, you go like, this one, I think I take it quote unquote literally, this one figuratively, this one literally. And if you find yourself doing that, I want you to wonder. I want you to ask yourself, why am I doing that? And that's, if nothing else, a very good question. Maybe just be consistent. All right.